At 2 o'clock in the morning on April 27, 1865, the steamboat Sultana was moving north on the Mississippi River, 7 miles beyond Memphis. Nearly 2,000 released Union prisoners were aboard, finally traveling home after the Civil War. The Sultana was legally rated for only 376 passengers. Its decks were so crowded that men slept beneath the smokestacks, beside the machinery, and along the railings. One of its boilers had been patched only days earlier. Then 3 of the boat's 4 boilers ruptured. The center of the Sultana disappeared in steam, shattered timber, and fire. Hundreds of weakened soldiers were thrown into the river. Nearly 1,200 people would die. The central mystery is not only why the boilers failed, it is how a visibly overloaded steamboat carrying a known mechanical problem was allowed to leave, and why almost no one was ultimately held responsible. In the spring of 1865, the Civil War was ending, but thousands of Union soldiers were still far from home. Many had been held in Confederate prisons, including Andersonville in Georgia and Cahaba in Alabama. They had survived disease, hunger, exposure, and severe overcrowding. Some emerged so weak they could barely stand. From the prison camps, they were moved to a parole camp near Vicksburg, Mississippi, where the federal government had to arrange transportation north. For men from Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Kentucky, Tennessee, and other states, the Mississippi River offered the fastest route toward rail connections and eventually home. That need created an opportunity for private steamboat owners. The government paid operators to transport released prisoners. Each additional soldier meant additional revenue. Captain James Cass Mason, part owner and master of the Sultana, wanted the contract. In Vicksburg, he dealt with Captain Reuben Hatch, the Union quartermaster involved in arranging the transportation. Later historical research describes an agreement in which Hatch would direct a large group of prisoners to the Sultana in exchange for part of Mason's payment. Whatever the exact terms, the incentive was clear. The more men placed aboard, the more money the voyage could produce. The Sultana itself was not an old wreck. Built in Cincinnati in 1863, it was a 260-foot wooden side-wheel steamboat that traveled the Mississippi and its tributaries. Its 4 high-pressure tubular boilers produced steam efficiently, but the design also made them difficult to clean. Mud and sediment from river water could collect around the tightly packed tubes. That buildup could insulate the metal from the water meant to cool it, creating areas of dangerous heat. On the Sultana's final trip, there was another warning. As the boat approached Vicksburg, one boiler developed a leak and a bulging plate. A local boilermaker recommended a more extensive repair, but that work would have delayed the boat and could have cost Mason the prisoner contract. Instead, the damaged plate was hammered back into shape and covered with a temporary patch. The repair allowed the Sultana to leave quickly. It did not make the underlying situation safe. On April 24th, the prisoners began boarding. There was no careful limit at 376. Men continued down the Vicksburg landing and onto the boat. Cabins filled. Passageways disappeared. Soldiers covered the main deck and upper decks until the vessel looked less like public transportation than a military formation standing on water. The final number remains uncertain, but more than 2,100 passengers and crew were probably aboard. Roughly 1,900 were paroled Union soldiers. The overloading was not hidden. It was photographed. When the Sultana stopped at Helena, Arkansas, on April 26th, a photographer captured men packed across nearly every visible deck. It remains one of the most disturbing images connected to the disaster because the danger is visible before anything has happened. The boat was not necessarily too heavy to stay afloat. The more immediate danger was the way its human load was distributed. Hundreds of men were crowded high above the waterline, making the Sultana top-heavy. As the vessel turned through the river, it could list from side to side. That movement may have mattered below deck. The Sultana's 4 boilers were connected. If the boat leaned, water could shift away from the highest boiler. Metal that should have remained covered might then overheat. When the vessel rolled back, water could return to the overheated surface and rapidly turn into steam. Sediment inside the boilers could have made those hotspots worse. This is one leading explanation for the explosion. It is not the only one, and the surviving evidence does not prove the exact sequence. The temporary patch, the boiler design, sediment, water level, metal condition, and the boat's severe top heaviness all remain part of the discussion. What can be said with certainty is that several known risks were allowed to exist at the same time. Late on April 26, the Sultana reached Memphis. A large cargo of sugar was unloaded from the hold. Removing that weight from low in the vessel made the crowded upper decks even more significant to the boat's stability. After midnight, the Sultana continued north. Most of the soldiers were asleep. Among them were men who had spent months imagining this journey home. Sergeant Charles Nickerson of the 65th Ohio Infantry had been wounded and captured at Chickamauga, then imprisoned at Andersonville. He had survived the camp and reached the Sultana. He would not survive the river. At about 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 boilers ruptured. The blast tore upward through the center of the vessel. The pilohouse and sections of the upper decks collapsed. Scalding steam, broken machinery, bricks, burning coal and timber struck the men sleeping nearest the boilers. The explosion did not destroy the entire boat at once. That made the next few minutes even more dangerous. Fire moved through the shattered wooden structure. Men trapped beneath collapsed decks could not reach the railings. Others climbed across wreckage toward the stern. Many had no choice but to jump. Private Commodore Smith of the 18th Michigan Infantry awoke on the lower deck, pinned beneath dead and wounded soldiers and debris from the decks above. In a later account, he described remaining on the wreck long enough to throw loose boards and pieces of timber into the river, giving other men something to hold. Only when the fire forced him away did he enter the water. He survived. Hundreds around him did not. The Mississippi was high, cold, and fast. Many of the former prisoners were malnourished and physically exhausted. Some could not swim. Others entered the river burned, scalded, or injured by the blast. Men clung to doors, beams, railings, and broken pieces of the paddle wheels. Some reached flooded trees along the Arkansas bank. Others drifted for miles toward Memphis. The southbound steamer Bostonna No. 2 turned back toward the fire. Its crew lowered small boats and began pulling survivors from the river. Boats from Memphis, military vessels, and people along the banks joined the rescue. City hospitals received men suffering from burns, exposure, broken bones, and near drowning. Captain Mason survived the initial explosion and was reportedly seen throwing wreckage into the water for others. He later disappeared from the burning vessel and died. His body was never identified. By daylight, the Sultana had burned to the waterline. It drifted toward the Arkansas bank and sank. The number of dead became confused almost immediately. Passenger rolls were incomplete, some names appeared more than once, and early reports depended heavily on estimates. For generations, accounts often placed the death toll between 1,500 and 1,800. More recent name-by-name research puts the number closer to 1,200, with approximately 1,169 deaths. That figure is below the traditional estimate, and below the death toll of the Titanic. Even so, the Sultana is still widely regarded as the deadliest maritime disaster in United States history. The investigation produced no single simple answer. The boilers were destroyed. The boat burned and sank. Important witnesses, including Mason, were dead. Engineers and officials debated low water, sediment, weak metal, the tubular boiler design, the temporary repair, and the Sultana's side-to-side listing. The patched boiler became the most familiar explanation, but modern research cautions against treating it as the proven trigger. The deeper failure was systemic. A damaged boiler was patched to avoid delay. A government transport system rewarded volume. Officers allowed a boat rated for hundreds to carry more than 2,000 people. The warnings were visible, yet the voyage continued. The search for accountability produced little. Captain Frederick Speed, an Army officer connected to moving the prisoners from the parole camp, was court-martialed and convicted of neglect. That conviction was later overturned. Hatch avoided meaningful punishment. Mason was dead. Other officials blamed one another, and no individual became legally responsible for the deaths. The disaster was not hidden by a demonstrated government cover-up. Newspapers reported it, and the government preserved records of the dead and the survivors. But its timing pushed the Sultana beneath events that already dominated national attention. Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated less than 2 weeks earlier. John Wilkes Booth was killed on April 26th, one day before the explosion. Lincoln's funeral train was crossing the country, Confederate armies were surrendering, and Americans were trying to understand the end of 4 years of war. The Sultana entered the news when the nation's capacity for grief was already overwhelmed. Its victims were also scattered across Midwestern communities, rather than concentrated among famous passengers or political leaders. Survivors formed associations and held reunions, but the disaster never gained the same place in national memory as later catastrophes. Even the river moved on. The Mississippi eventually shifted east, leaving the probable wreck site beneath Arkansas soil, far from the modern channel. The boat once photographed almost disappearing beneath the weight of its passengers is now believed to lie under farmland. That buried wreck is an appropriate final image, not because the Sultana was intentionally erased. It was buried by the river, overshadowed by national events, and shielded from accountability by confusion, death, and institutional failure. The men aboard had survived battlefields and prison camps. Their final journey should have been the safest part of their war. Instead, a chain of profitable decisions placed them aboard a damaged, unstable, and grossly overcrowded boat. The boilers caused the explosion, but the disaster began before the Sultana ever left Vicksburg.